Hi, welcome to the Air Manager API tutorial video series. In this video we're going to be taking a look at switch. So the switch functions here on the wiki page, fairly simple and self-explanatory. There's an add function and then a couple of functions to set the state of the switch and to get the position of the switch so you can read it at some later point in your code. There's also some additional settings that you can set up depending on if you're using a touch screen or a mouse, and you may want to include both of those settings depending on if there's a plan to use it on touchscreens in the future, so it might be worthwhile thinking ahead and planning for those settings. So we'll talk about the touch and the mouse settings, particularly those ones that are pertinent to using them with switch. So you can see here with the switch add function, you give it an ID as is normal with most of these functions now. And then you give it a series of images, which are all the different images of how the switch will look in all the different positions. So you can see there this just says image position N, so that can be any number of images there for each of the different switch positions. In our example today we're just going to look at a 3-position switch just to keep it fairly simple. And then some XY settings, so where you want it to appear on your instrument, the width and the height, so how big you want the switch image to be, and then a callback, so every time that switch is changed in your control panel, the callback gets called, and whatever code you've got in that callback will get actioned. So let's close that down for a minute and delve right in with what we've got here. So I've got Air Manager open, and as you can see I had the sim open there, and I've set up some example code here to look at switch. So what we're going to start with, we'll start very basically with doing the switch add here. So on this line here you can see I've got the switch add. I've given it the ID switch ID, and then I've given it 3 different images, so switch1.png, switch2, switch3. So they're my 3 different images, and that's essentially a picture of the same switch just rotated. It's got a little, you'll see when we run the instrument, it's got a little white marker on it, so essentially it's just the same. Very easy to create those images. Essentially you just create your main switch image, and then you just rotate it in your image software, and then save that off as a different number or different name, whatever you want to call it. In terms of, it might be a particular function, so you might want to give it a function name, but whatever you want, you give it the 3 images in there, and it will just use that image for the first position, that image for the second position, and that image for the third position. I'm calling them 1, 2, 3 here, but actually you'll see when we get into the callback they're actually referenced as 0, 1 and 2. So ignore the 1, 2, 3 for a minute. That's just what I've called the PNG images. So we're going to set this image up, or this switch up, to be 10 pixels in from the left and 60 pixels down, and we're going to make it 80 pixels width and height, and we're going to use the switch click callback function as our callback, so the switch click callback function at the very top here. So what all that essentially does, that callback, is it will return the direction that you've clicked the switch and the position that the switch is in. So you can see here in this callback it returns the position. I've just called it pos, and it will return the direction. I've called it dir, short for direction. And then within the function here, I'm basically saying if the direction is 1, so similar to a dial when we get onto dealing with dials, and again when we get onto dealing with the hardware, elements, a lot of these functions where there's a direction to be had, the direction will either be a +1 or a -1 to denote if you've actually moved that rotary control in a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction. So if the direction is 1, then in this particular case we're going to issue a command to our simulator saying wind the HSI select switch up, and then obviously if it's in the other direction we're going to do wind the HSI select switch down, and you'll see the effects of that in a minute. Now this is I've added, you'll see I've added a couple of switches here, and I wanted to show you just a couple of ways of looking at how to code your switch. If we go back to the wiki page here and look at the switch add function, you'll see it goes into quite a bit of detail here with some examples, and it gives an example 1 and example 2. Instrument determines switch position in example 2, and X-plane determines switch position recommended. So this is kind of this is what we're looking at the moment, this example 1. This gives you a complete closed loop. So you issue the command with the switch, but the position of the switch in your instrument does not change. It gets the position information in terms of the how to display the graphic back from the sim. So if the sim didn't receive your command for any reason, then it doesn't acknowledge or doesn't change the relevant data ref or whatever it is that you're looking at, and so therefore you don't get any feedback back in Air Manager, so the actual graphic doesn't move. So that would prompt you to action flick the switch again, or do that action again to actually get it to be where you want it to be. So it's a complete closed loop, whereas doing it the other way, the example 2 method, the instrument determines that switch position. You can just drive the graphic to say, yep, I'm in that new position now, but you don't 100% know that the sim is actually in the same mode and is actually synced to be the same. So that's why example 1 is the recommended method of actually driving your switches. But there might be some instances where you might want to do it this way, and I'm going to show both sort of methods in the examples today. So let's go back to our code window. So as I said, we're looking at that first example first. So what we've done is we've just sent a command to the sim, and that's essentially it. We haven't done anything else yet. So we send the command to the sim, and then further on in our code we're subscribing to a data ref here, sim cockpit 2 radios actuators HSI source select. So that's our actual switch that we want to, where we've asked to change either go up or go down with. This is the actual position of that switch, and so whenever that changes within the sim, so in other words after we've issued the command, some small amount of time after that, it should update this data ref, and Air Manager will see that this data ref has changed, and it should issue this callback new HSI selection, I've called it, which is this little function just above here. And all I've got literally in that function is a statement, and this is where the set part of the switch function comes in, and that is switch set state. You give it the switch ID that you created when you created or you did the switch add. That's the switch ID there, so I've just called it switch underscore ID, and then you update that switch position with the information coming back from the sim. So I've just called the variable here sim switch position. This is what we get back from this data ref. So all we're going to do is we're going to send that piece of information straight to the switch set function, and then the switch set function is going to update the switch. So the graphic should move at that time to the position, so it's the same as what's in the sim. So you'll see how that works in a minute when we have a look at that in operation with the sim. So let's go ahead and we'll talk about this the second switch here and the second function related to that switch in a minute, because that's the other example. So we'll get our instrument going here, And you can see, don't worry about the one on the right a minute, because that's our second switch. That's for another example. But you can see here that we've got a switch lined up. In fact, what I've done there is I've inadvertently left it on touch. We'll come back to that in a minute. So there we go. We're back onto mouse control. So we're focusing on this left switch for the moment. So if I just see the SIM there, this is the switch that we're actually talking about. This is the HSI source select switch. I think I'm in the Baron here, and so you can select what drives the HSI, either the nav1, nav2, or the GPS. So you can see if I click in the SIM, just watch very carefully the graphic in the little instrument window here. If I click in the SIM here round to nav2, you can see immediately my my switch clicks round, and when I go round to GPS, oh, it didn't work. Why didn't that work? There we go, GPS. So that's what I was talking about. Sometimes if you miss that communication, I don't understand why that didn't work. That's normally pretty reliable. So let's try again. Nav1, Nav2, GPS. Here you go. Nav2, Nav1. So the one time we wanted it to work, it didn't. But that's essentially what needs to happen in terms of the communication between the SIM and Air Manager. So Air Manager is just literally subscribing to that data ref and doing that. So that's this part of the code here where we're subscribing to the data ref, and then we're setting the switch state, and that should then store that switch position value, and at the same time it's updating the graphic, so it will basically show whichever of these switch images correlates to the position that is returned. So if it was position 0, it would show the first one, position 1, position 2, and however many more if you happen to have. This is only a 3-position switch, but you can see the same applies no matter how many positions you've got. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go the other way. We're going to drive the instrument now from the we're going to drive the switch from the instrument, and we're going to watch what happens in the with the SIM switch up here. So this time we're going to go backwards to nav2. You can see it flick back to nav2 there, and then back to nav1, nav2, GPS, nav2, whoops, nav1, nav2, GPS, nav2, nav1. So you can see there what's actually happening there then is you're commanding the switch to change, which is you clicking on the switch here, and then it doing a switch, calling this switch click callback, and then actioning one of these commands depending on if we've clicked up or if we've clicked down, or clockwise or counterclockwise if you like. So that's where the whole the whole link is complete. When we command for that, when we do that one click there down to nav2, then we send the command to the SIM. The SIM receives a command, it updates the data ref, Air Manager's subscribed to that data ref, it sees that subscription change, and it then uses that set command to change the graphic and the stored value. So you can see it's a little bit complex, but it makes sense in terms of there being a handshaking going on there between the SIM and the instrument themselves, and you can obviously means that you get the same indication whether you're in the you control it from in the SIM or you do it within Air Manager. I personally prefer to just use the Air Manager instrument and not worry about the SIM too much, because I like the screen to be clear and not have to look at the instrument panel. We've got a wonderful tool in Air Manager to look at our instruments. We don't necessarily need to look at these instruments in the SIM, but that's just my personal preference. Okay, so that's the first example of how you sync them together like that. Let's look at the second example now. I've just called this one switch2_ID. Essentially it's almost the same thing, and as you can see from the instrument that I've already run, I've shifted it over to the right a little bit more, and that's this one over here. But this particular one is only a 2 position, so I've only got 2 images in here, and we're going to call back switch 2 click callback, which is his second function here. Now in the first function I was just using the direction as a way of determining what needed to happen, but in this function I'm using the position and the direction. So what I'm essentially doing here, I'm just actually going to print here, and we're going to update. You can see now we've got our switch set state is actually in the callback rather than getting the switch set state is being done from the subscribe from the sim in the first example. So that is obviously after waiting for the sim to confirm that it's received the command and update its data ref. In this instance, you're not doing that. You're updating the switch set state straight away in the callback. So as soon as you command the switch set state gets updated. The sim, if you were putting sim commands or data refs, or you were writing anything to the sim in here, and you was updating the set state in here as well, just because you've updated the set state and it says one thing here on the instrument doesn't necessarily mean that the sim has got exactly the same data. It might have missed that communication, or it might have got out of sync for some reason. If you were just sending commands saying toggle, you may be on, it may be off, and every time you toggle it, it does the opposite. So it's not ideal for that sort of thing, and it's better to use the example one for that. So what we do in the code here is we just take the existing position and then we change it by whatever the direction is. So if the because it's a 2-position switch, it's just positions 0 and 1. So if the direction is up, that will be +1. So you'd say 0 + 1. So therefore move position 0 to position 1. And if it's already in position 1, then the direction back from there can only be a -1. So that would be 1 - 1. So that would take it back to 0. So it just toggles between 1 and 0 essentially. And you can see every time we do that, we print the position to the console here, just so we can see what's happening, and we use that switch set state function again to update switch 2 ID with the latest position information, which is what we've worked out here. So that will change the graphic on here. So you can see here when I click, it just toggles around. Let's see what's actually happening. So yeah, we've got a little print here that says position 1, position 0, position 1, position 0. So you can see you can just keep toggling that, and you'll just get the 2 different positions toggling backwards and forwards. Now you can see here, although I've used switch adds for both of these functions here, because the first one is a 3-position switch, we get the little plus and minus symbols coming up on the overlay of the graphic there. But this one, because it's only a 2-position switch, we don't get any plus or minus come up, because it treats a 2-position switch as just an on-off toggle. So it provides a little hand, and all you have to do is then just click it to just essentially toggle between the 2 separate states, because there isn't 3, 4, 5, 6 states. This one would appear for that for the different positions there. But for a simple 2-position switch, you just get the hand. There is a way of overriding that, and I'll show you how to do that in just a bit. So we've covered the 2 functions and the 2 switch adds. We've looked at the data ref and the subscription for the data ref. So all of that code we've looked at already. What we're going to do now is we're just going to look at the so that is essentially covers the add and the switch set states, which we looked at in a couple of different instances. Now we're going to look at the get. So this is a way of reading the switch position. If you wanted to, some later point in your code, get the position of the switch, we can do that. And so what I've set up here is just to try and demonstrate that, because we haven't got a big full instrument and we don't want to look at it at a later date. I've just set a little timer up here to run for 10 seconds. So after 10 seconds it will go and get the switch position for switch ID, so that's our left switch here, and it will print it to the console. So if we rerun our instrument here, you can see that we're currently in position 0, so it's facing up. So after 10 seconds it should say position, get position, in other words, yeah, there you go, get position equals 0. So we run it again. This time we'll change that down to position 2, and then when the 10 seconds expires, it should do that. There you go. So it's now gone and looked and said, what's your position now? And it's now reporting 2. So you can see at some later point in your code, if you want to establish where is the switch set, you can use that switch get position to get that number, and essentially it just returns the ID of the wherever the switch is currently pointed to at that point in time when you run that function. So fairly self-explanatory with that one. And then just down the bottom here, we're going to have a little look at how you can influence the behavior of some of the touch and mouse settings used with switches. So if we just go back to the Wiki API page here, you'll see that for switch there's some touch settings and some mouse settings. So we'll look at the mouse settings first, seeing as I've just flicked it back to mouse control at the moment. And you can see here in the table here, some of these are generic across a few of the different functions, like dial and switch and scroll wheel and button, which we've already looked at with the cursor. And so we've got a similar, we can perform a similar thing here with the switch. You can change the you can use this property called cursor, and you can change what cursor appears when, instead of that hand that came up on that 2-position switch, just like with a button, you can have some kind of custom graphic of your own appear instead of the default one. And the same here additionally on switch and also dial. When we come to it, we'll look at that. But also additionally with switch, you can have the cursor left and right appear as well. Now these need to be, and I think I've said this in a previous video, these images must be 32 by 32 pixels. If they're anything other than that, it will not work. So let's go and see what the effects of that actually are. So if I uncomment these mouse settings now for a minute, I'll talk about each one, and you can see what essentially will happen with each one. You use the command mouse setting, as you saw on the wiki page there, and then you give it the ID of the particular node that you're interested in. So in this case, I'm just going to use switch 2 for this first one, and then just the normal switch ID for the second two. So there are our two switches that we set up. So we're going to apply this first one to the second one, because that's the one that has a hand on it. So we want to change that hand for this custom graphic that I've created called cursor.png. I think we use that when we're doing the button video, so you've probably seen that already. I've just got a funky hand that will come up that when we run the code in a minute. And so that's the cursor property. And then the other two additional properties that we haven't looked at before, because they didn't apply to button, and they are cursor left and cursor right. So they're the you can see I've applied these to the first of the two switches here. So this one on the left here. So instead of these arrows with a plus symbol and arrow with a minus symbol that appear when you hover over the edges of the switches, indicating that it's something that can be controlled, you can again take those graphics away and put something else in your place. Now I've not done anything fancy. I've just knocked a couple of crude images up, but just to show you the concept of you can make yourself some fancy little graphics up there if you want to, and position them instead of using these default ones. So they're uncommented there. Let's go ahead and run this now. So these again, these images, as with any images or any resource for the instrument, are stored in your resources. Sorry, in the folder in the resources area here. That's where you that's where you store the images for these little cursors and arrows. So let's have a look at the first one first. And so the first one is the cursor. So you can see now, you probably just saw it appear there. As I hover over there, instead of the default hand that I had on there before, I've got this weird funky looking handprint now in place of it, but you can, as you can see, you can put something else in there, a custom graphic that would appear instead of the default white hand, and it obviously operates exactly the same, but it just puts a different graphic up. And then on the other one, with the cursor left and the cursor right, rather than the default curved arrow with the plus and the minus symbols, I've just changed that to a down arrow and an up arrow, so you can see as I flick between the two sides there, we get a different graphic appear there. So that's all them functions really do in terms of those particular things on the switch. So now what we'll do is I'll flick the Air Manager back to touch control, and we'll have a look at these touch settings. So with the touch, let's just make sure that we're working okay. Yeah. Okay, so you can see here that when you touch on an object in Air Manager, you get the little blue highlight on it to let you know that something has been that is touch enabled, is ready for action in terms of the dial there for the switch. And so these settings pertain to the touch settings specifically. So we'll look at each one. We'll go back to the touch settings, and you can see again, similar to with the mouse ones, there's a few here for different ones. Switch dial. That one's for scroll wheel only, and that one's for switch. So the ones that apply to switch then are show highlight, rotate tick, and force rotate mode. So what do they actually do? Okay, so we have the three properties that we're allowed to use for switch relating to the touch here, and I've written what the defaults are down the side here. So the that is the default, as in terms of the behavior that you would get if you weren't using these functions. This is what they would default to. So the show highlight is the blue highlight. Let's just get that up again. There's the blue highlight on the switch when I touch it. I can the default is true, and you can see currently I've got it set to true, but if we were to change that to false and then rerun our instrument, now I'm touched on the instrument, and we don't get any blue highlight. Change it back to true again. You get the blue highlight back. So you can see if you don't want to show the blue highlight, it's very simple. Just use that touch setting function. Call out the particular item that you don't want the highlight to be on. Use the show highlight property and just set it to false. I personally think it's quite useful to see that you've actually touched the object and showing it, and it's quite a faint, nice blue. So it's actually quite useful. The next setting is rotate tick. So with rotate tick, and you can see I've got it set to the default value at the moment, but the default is 20. So again, if I was to comment this out and not use this, it would be 20. But I can change it to a much bigger number. So what you'll see with this one is that as I you see, as I've only got to move my finger. You can't actually see that there, but I'm only moving my finger a very small amount there. You can see the switch is changing quite quickly between the two stops, and it's actually quite hard for me to actually move that switch round and get it to stop in position. Let's try it. There you go, position 1. because there's only 20 degrees. So what that basically means is there's 20 degrees of rotation as I put my finger on the control there and I rotate it. I've only actually got to move through an arc of 20 degrees before it will register as me wanting to move to the next position. So in practice, it's actually quite fine and difficult to control that. But if I change that to, well, you could put whatever number you want in there, but I'll change it to a much bigger number, say like 120 degrees. And now what we'll see, let's rerun our instrument, don't forget to do that, is that when I touch on the instrument now, I can move a little bit and nothing actually happens to the switch until I move quite a bit more distance. So I actually got a much better level of control there. I've actually got to move my finger a fair bit there to get it to go back to 1, and then a fair bit again to get it to go back to 0 again. Then go back the other way to 1 to 2. So you can see how you can play with the rotate tick number to give it the sort of level of control that you feel it needs for that particular control. This is only a basic switch, but yeah, you could use that for any item that you're using or deeming that you're using as a switch. You can apply this touch function to. It might make it a little bit easier in some cases to actually get the kind of control that you need from that switch. And then the last one here is force rotate mode. So you can see I'm applying those first two to this switch here on the left because we use the switch _ ID there. This one I'm applying to switch 2 ID simply because this is only a 2-position switch, and as I said to you, that if Air Manager knows it's only a 2-position switch, it will default the control of that 2-position switch to just being a touch. So you can see that when I touch this particular switch, bearing in mind we have got show highlight turned to true, it doesn't actually highlight blue at all. But it will just keep, every time I touch it, as you saw when I was doing the mouse control, it's changing up here in the console, and you can see the graphics changing every time I touch the switch. It just needs a click. It's not a rotate. It's not a highlight and put your finger around and try and rotate one. It's just a touch. So because that is that type of switch, and it always defaults to that kind of switch, if I don't want that behavior, because Air Manager automatically does that if it's only a 2-position switch as I showed earlier, you can turn that behavior off, and that's called force rotate mode. So if I don't want that clicking 2-position switch, which I think actually is probably easy to control than doing the rotate, so but if you want to be a purist and say, well, actually it's a rotary switch, so I want a rotary motion to actually control it, you can use this force rotate mode, which will actually force you to rotate it. At the moment I've left it as false. You can see the default is false, so if we didn't use this at all, it would default to false. And if it's a 2-position switch, it would go to click mode. If I force it to true, no matter if it's a 2-position switch or not, it will always rotate because we've forced the rotate mode. So let's try that now. Now when I click on it, you can see it highlights blue, so I can't just push it anymore as I'm trying to do here. You can see it blowing. The switch is not moving. I actually have to touch the switch and then rotate it to get it to click. Yep. So that's force rotate mode. I think that's pretty much it in terms of certainly the functionality of switch and the touch and the mouse settings. It's fairly straightforward. A little bit involved there with some of these settings, but you don't have to use the touch and the mouse settings. It just maybe gives you that little bit more level of control in terms of how that particular item is going to operate within your instrument, depending on what it is. So I think that concludes the video on switch. I hope you enjoyed watching. Please join me again for another video soon. See you again soon. Thanks. Bye.